Right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the after lunch session. So today we are going to be talking about alternate governance. This is a really exciting space right now. There's been some big announcements lately. I think the one we are all thinking about is the announcement from Patagonia earlier this year, talking about how they donated the whole company to fighting climate change, which is a lot of what we're here to do today is to make an impact in the world. And I think it's a really increasingly important discussion, just given the economic power that many of these corporations wield and how they actually do rival many nation states. So in this context here today, looking at food and agriculture and its impact on the world, I think this is also an important conversation to have within food and ag tech. So with me today, I have two great panelists. They bring two different perspectives to the table. We have one that's actually working in this space, working for an alternate governance corporation with that model, and an individual that sets up these companies. So all different kinds of models. So with that, I'd like my panelists to introduce themselves. Tell me about who you are, your organization, and your experience working in alternate governance. Jay, I'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, everybody. This is such a treat, and thanks, Abigail, for the opportunity. My name's Jay Novin. I'm the only full-time staff member at the Berkeley Student Food Collective. How many of y'all have been to the Food Collective before? Okay, so we see some hands in the crowd. It's right down there on Bancroft and Telegraph. It's a small little store about the size of a corner store that students started in 2010 because for the first time, UC Berkeley was going to move fast food onto the campus. And so it was Panda Express at the time. Students were pissed about it. They got up in all arms, had different protests across the bay in a panda suit, telling Panda Express that we didn't actually want a giant corporation offering fast food for issues of sourcing, for issues of workers' rights, for issues of nutrition on the campus, and we're able to successfully terminate that contract. And at the end of that campaign, there was a question from the university that said, okay, so you got this contract canceled, what are you going to do instead? And so students got together at that time, they roused their community, they developed business plans, they did a bunch of fundraising, and they got the initial capital to open up a small grocery store, which is right basically in the heart of campus, right on Bancroft and Telegraph. They incorporated as a 501c3, so it's an independent nonprofit from the campus that's completely controlled by the students that run the store. So we have about 150 volunteers that come in each and every week to the storefront to serve in 2-hour shifts where they cashier, they cook in the back, and they also run all different parts of the store. And them volunteering gets them a vote, and that vote allows them to elect the board of directors. It allows them to vote on key member and organizational issues, and to hire and fire staff. So that's where I come in. There's a lot to talk about with the Food Collective, but I'll pause right there and just briefly mention that another part of my work involves working with the network of Bay Area worker cooperatives. So the Food Collective is a nonprofit that's governed cooperatively, meaning that its members are the ones that control the business, not proportionate to the amount of capital that they have invested in it. And we're lucky here in the Bay Area to be a part of a really rich ecosystem of worker-owned, worker-governed businesses. We have about 75 or 85 businesses across the Bay Area that are managed and owned and run by their employees. And so I do a lot of work with that network, supporting them in building social connections, but also lobbying and advocacy to expand the power that workers have as owners of their own businesses. So I'll pause right there and pass things over to Lars.
Oh, thank you. Good job. So Lars Johansson, I born and raised in Sweden. I came here 30 years ago. I've been practicing law for 23 years. I was at some of the biggest law firms in the world for 19 years, 14 as a partner. And then in 2018, I wanted to become more like many of you here, a little bit more of an entrepreneur, and I traveled up the elevator and I handed in my notice of withdrawal from the partnership, traveled down, went to Apple, got myself a computer and set up my own shop. And then I combined with Sylvia, who is here. We have a firm, it's Berks Johansson, and what we do is international business transactions, cross-border work with a focus on venture finance and M&A. So we help a lot of clients establish themselves in the U.S., migrate here, or the other way. We represent investors and portfolio companies. For today's topic, I have we set up nonprofits, we set up benefit corporations, which I think might be of an interest. The typical Silicon Valley model with C Corps, LLCs, joint ventures, and so on. And I hope we get to it. The trend we've seen is people realize what we've been talking about here for 2 days now, the collaborative aspects. So we have a client that wants to go to Jupiter. And it's not enough to build one company to go to Jupiter, so he's building a whole ecosystem around it with different types of entities. And I think that's kind of an interesting trend that we see. Mm-hmm. So that's my background. Hand it back to you.
You almost stole my question there, Lars. Yeah. So we've talked about the collective so far, and obviously there's many different types of alternate governance models. But Lars, would you extend upon the answer? What are the different types of alternate governance models that you're seeing, and kind of what are the trends around them?
Yeah, so typically when clients come and they need to set something up quickly, they want to do it on the cheap, it's fast, they want to protect their personal assets, or they want to be set up to do a financing in the US, and it's a Delaware corporation. That's still the model, that the only thing almost that Silicon Valley accepts. Then you can have limited liability companies that work for US businesses, not for foreign-owned businesses. So then when we get into the alternative models, we're talking nonprofits, nonprofit corporations. It can also be nonprofit LLCs that raise money through donations, grants, and so forth. And what we've been talking about for the 2 days now, I think there are probably many of you could benefit from being affiliated with a nonprofit, but they can attract grants and so on, and then you have the for-profit business separately. You have benefit corporations, I'm sure you heard of, where you can become a so-called B corporation, which can have as a mission something more than maximizing shareholder value. And then you have cooperatives, which are great. We had one client that, and I think what happens as working as a lawyer, you know, the legal systems and the way we work with entities, we're the last ones to adjust. I mean, for 2 days we've been talking about all this innovation, and you guys are living in the future. That's not where we live. And some of this haven't been updated, but we have enough flexibility through contracts to create exactly what you want to create. And I think we can see it in the younger clients, that there is a need to find a different way of doing business, allocating the benefits and incentivizing employees. Did that answer the...
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'd love, Jay, to get into your experience a bit more. What first attracted you to the Berkeley Student Food Collection, and I guess what surprised you working in this non-traditional way?
Totally. Well, I think in terms of the trends that we're seeing in terms of alternative governance models, cooperatives is something that, when I was a student at UC Berkeley, was definitely percolating and catching my interest. You had this very high-profile campaign that was happening with students on campus around this food cooperative, but you also started to see a lot of other organizations that were governed by their workers or otherwise governed by their members popping up. And this is something that we're seeing more and more, particularly in California. One, I think, instance of that is worker cooperatives. For instance, you now have in West Oakland a Black-owned, worker-owned cooperative grocery store, Mandela Grocery, that's popped up and really become a hub for work that's happening around food and community in West Oakland. You see the Food Collective, and again, every year you're starting to see a little bit more interest in this, even from the municipal level, where local governments are saying, well, we're looking to incentivize additional employee ownership in order to build wealth in communities that are having that wealth extracted through issues like the housing crisis in 2008. When you see Black and brown communities that have had the wealth that they've generated over the last couple of decades extracted by exploitative mortgage owners, you as a local official are trying to think of how are we going to build wealth in other ways? How are we going to support people in building wealth in other ways? And so worker cooperatives have been really big. In terms of the trends that I think are exciting to keep a tab on, SB 1497 just passed the governor's desk in Sacramento, which means that now in the state business development office, there is now a worker ownership arm. And so they're going to be investing a lot more state resources in worker ownership, whether that's through a worker cooperative model or through an employee stock ownership program, ESOPs, if that means anything to folks in the room. But in terms of what attracted me, I think it's the same thing that's attracting a lot of folks across the state and across the country, which is I would love to be involved in a business in which I am not answering to essentially a dictator based off of their position in the company. And so having a multi-stakeholder model ensures that in terms of my professional career, there will be many different people to engage with in the deliberative processes that make up any business. I'm not just going to be yesing and knowing, and I think, Lars, you touched on this in terms of getting out of these firms that control much of our waking lives and seeing if there can be a collaborative process, even if that means that there might be sacrifices in terms of the amount of money that I'm going to be making or the amount of capital I'm going to have control over at work. And so the Food Collective was appealing to me because not only was it going to be a workplace in which there was not going to be one boss, but a series of students and other stakeholders that are going to be making decisions about my employment and life, but also that there is an opportunity there to bring in a number of young people to share this model and teach them about alternatives to the classic corporate model.
Mm-hmm. I love that. That's great. And Lars, for you, is there any surprises that you've seen working with companies looking to these, alternate models?
No surprises. But I think there's a growing need. You can see there's a tension now. So we had one client, for example. This is not food tech related, but he wanted to take back the ownership of your private data. So how do you do that and keep that from the business model changing? So he wanted to put the service in Switzerland, because that will be out of reach from the government. He wanted to have a co-op, a consumer cooperative in Colorado, and that will become sort of the data bank that we will be members of. Then there was a peer-to-peer bank in this system that will be where people would be asked to give back money to finance the development of technology and so forth. And I think this is a model that we will see more and more, because many of the challenges, like we talked about over the last 2 days, how do you find investors that will stick with you, that will finance a project that might take, it's not a 5-year project, it's a 10, 15. And so I think these models where you find points of collaboration and financing will become more important. We represent a syndicate of credit unions, and I don't know if you all know what a credit union is, but it's a member-based bank. And they have a ton of cash on their balance sheets, but they don't have members to loan the money to. So what we did, the syndicate of the 5 credit unions, they invested in a fintech, so they will allow them to memberize quickly and deploy, and they're talking billions a year in financing. And they have a different profile in terms of lending. They do more unsecured lending, for example, than some of the traditional large banks. So I think there are a lot of solutions here, but we kind of need to get out of the thinking of it, we're setting up one entity separate, and then we seek a relationship.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And Jay, you touched on this a little bit with your own story, not working for a dictator, having multiple, stakeholders involved. Can you talk about what the employee buy-in is like? So not just for you, but for the people you work with. What is that like? Are they more motivated by this model?
Totally. Well, I can cite some different sources that have shown that when there's an economic downturn, which I'm sure all of y'all have been looking at the economic forecasts for the next year or so, but showing that worker cooperatives tend to retain employees better. They tend to be able to be more solvent than traditional businesses, and that's just because there is a wider network of people that do have a say in the way that the business is run. I think just by example, the Food Collective, we've been around for 12 years now, and that's certainly, it's not a worker cooperative in the traditional sense because it's a nonprofit, it's member run, but on our block, we are the last business that has survived over the last decade or so. There's no one else still on that block. And I think when you look at the other worker cooperatives around, even Berkeley, you look at worker ownership at the Cheese Board, for instance. If any of y'all have been to the Cheese Board down on Shattuck, that is a worker cooperative that has been around since the 60s. These are businesses that have a lot more buy-in than the capital that is funding most of the other places in our community, which means that not only are they more resilient in kind of a strict economic sense, but to get a little bit romantic with it, these are businesses that are built with the heart and the personal and community buy-in that an AstroTurf business that gets a fat check from an investor can never be. And I think when we think about what type of communities are we trying to build for our lives and what we want to pass on to the next generation, businesses that are built on the consensual buy-in of the workers that are running and owning it are just always going to have more lasting appeal, whether that's in just an ability to keep your doors open or whether that's the ability to be the heart of a community, which we know that specifically retail businesses, but also many other types of businesses have been in different crises for decades and centuries.
Excellent. So I think a common theme that's come up this week has been partnerships and how key they are for anyone to succeed. And I'm curious, what is your experiences with working with different types of partners when you are part of an alternate governance model? And I'll let whoever wants to answer go first.
You want to, you have if you have an alternative model, you have full flexibility and ability to enter into partnerships like any for-profit entity. But I agree with you. It comes with there's so much going into it today. If you have a business plan, you have how will you finance it? How will you raise enough money? How will you attract talent and the employees? How do you keep them motivated? And then how do you find these partnerships? And I think sometimes the partnerships, you're part of a culture or part of a ecosystem of sorts, and I think sometimes they are better tailored. It comes with different optics and a different field that can open up possibilities that 10 years ago, we always thought of a business, you're starting the for-profit and you give it your best shot. But I think now there's more competition. It's harder sometimes to get the capital, and you need to look at these alternative models to do that, to get the buy-in. Mm-hmm. And just one last point. I'm sure you guys are, if you have worked for startups, you receive stock options, which is the American currency of paying. And I think it's becoming more popular in the Nordics too. But these stock options they come with restrictions. So if you get in early, you have very low exercise price. But if you leave, you have to exercise that option within 90 days. And often there's it's a taxable event. You have an income on the difference between the fair value and the exercise price. But that makes it so it goes from being an incentive to sort of a straitjacket, where you can't really leave. This is too expensive to leave the company. And I think these are areas where we need to find ways to incentivize the employees in an ongoing way, other than just giving them more and more stock options, to get the rewards sooner.
Yeah, that already just sparks so much for me. I think, at the end of the day, if you're trying to run a business with other people and you're trying to own a business with other people in equal part, partnerships are kind of part and parcel with the whole thing. The whole thing is partnerships. I think it depends on what lens we're focusing on. At the Food Collective, that's an organization that is really tailored towards students that are trying to make radical changes in the food system. So our partnerships look anything like supporting the union that was trying to form at the HelloFresh warehouses in Richmond a couple of months ago, and doing text banks and phone banks and talking to workers there, or supporting with other various food system struggles. In terms of kind of corporate partnerships and what that might look like, cooperatives operate on this this set of principles which include Principle 6, which is cooperation among cooperatives. And so, for instance, we're always partnering with folks at Equal Exchange, which is a 100-plus person worker cooperative up in the Pacific Northwest that manufactures chocolate bars and coffee with their own producer cooperatives located in the Global South. So there are kind of intra or inter-company partnerships. But I think one particularly kind of interesting trend that we're seeing more and more is how folks are attracting limited investments from different constituencies in and across the community. One partnership that I think is really salient that I think about from my experience at the network of Bay Area worker cooperatives is this firm called EBPREC, the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative. They're attracting a lot of interest and investment right now because they're working with essentially a tripartite stakeholder system. One is they have the actual workers that work for the real estate cooperative, which themselves kind of are a govern the company equally. But then they also have these properties that they're buying to remove from the speculative market. So they've got, folks that are low income living in new properties that this cooperative is buying, and the residents of those properties now also have a stake in the cooperative. So there's the workers, there's the residents of the real estate cooperative, and then there's a community investment model. So anybody, I think, up to, I think it's $1,000 buy-in in the community can invest in the cooperative, and then they also have some degree of voting, and that voting is kind of split between the actual workers, the residents, and the small investors, of which they have many, many hundreds. And you're seeing this DPO model, which is related, where you're looking for small investors in the communities, come into more and more popularity. If anyone followed in West Oakland, the Community Foods Market grocery store, that was a direct public offering where they were looking specifically for small investors through new innovations in securities law, where before it used to be you had to be able to invest blah, blah, blah amount, but because of new crowdfunding technologies, you can really look for much smaller investors, which expands the pool of not only who you can have investing, but who can be involved in the governance of these new business models. So, long story short, community partnerships are paramount. Inter-cooperative or inter-firm partnerships are really paramount, and then the partnerships that we have between different constituencies that govern some of these new and radical models is really paramount too.
Yeah, it sounds like it's really, evening the playing field, so to speak, and giving everyone a voice and a say, and that's really powerful. So we have a lot of entrepreneurs in the room, a lot of really great companies in the room that are looking to expand to the U.S. as well. Do you have any guidance for them when setting up a company here? We're talking a lot about these alternate governance models. Is that the right place to start? Do you start, with your traditional corporation and then move to something else later? What are your thoughts on that? I'll start with you, Lars.
So if you're a foreign-owned business, there's only one model. There's only one entity that works really, and it's a corporation. You can set it up in any of the 50 states. I would suggest Delaware for reasons we can talk about afterwards. You could do an LLC too, but the LLC as a default is taxed as a partnership, so the owners end up paying the taxation. And you don't want to bring the owners into the U.S. tax reporting and income reporting and paying taxes. So it's really a Delaware corp. What you may want to do if you want to do partnerships in the U.S., so likely your partners in the U.S., if you have operating entities or distributors or whatever, they love the LLC structure because it's a pass-through tax entity, so you don't pay two levels of taxation. But as a foreign-owned entity, you don't want to set up the LLC, so you set up a Delaware corp as what we call a blocking entity, and underneath that entity, you can have these alternative entities like you have an LLC. You can't own a nonprofit, but you can have a nonprofit be not really an affiliate either, but be associated with a nonprofit that might own the technology that you make available to other participants in the ecosystem in return for getting grants and so on. So you can avail yourself of all of these, but you need to have that Delaware blocking entity on top to protect your foreign shareholders. Did I answer that question?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Perfect answer. Great. For my last question, I just want to end this panel looking towards the future, what we're looking forward to in this space. So what do you expect to happen in the future when it comes to alternate governance models? Do we expect more traditional corporations? Do you see more collectives and more buy-in from employees and other stakeholders in the future? What are your thoughts going forward? I'll start with you, Jay.
Well, I just wrote a paper for Yale Law on this exact subject, and I can speak largely from the grocery sector, which is the one that I'm most kind of ensconced in, and I think we are seeing actually a lot of innovation in terms of how folks are structuring the ways that people get food in the community, and I don't usually focus on the new 10-minute delivery service that some venture capitalist has funded every week in the Bay Area to get you your snacks in 5 minutes or less. But there is some really interesting stuff as we see, as you all probably know from the various communities that you're a part of, the kind of continued decline of independent grocers and small grocery stores in various communities. And so one of the things that's really exciting has been this proliferation of worker cooperative owned markets. In the Bay, of course, we have Mandela Grocery. There's a new grocery store that's trying to get its legs under it in East Oakland, the Deep Grocery Cooperative, also a worker cooperative. In San Francisco, we have Other Avenues, which is like 14 people, and then Rainbow Grocery is a worker-owned grocery store in San Francisco. They have about 200 worker owners who all govern the business collectively. But then you're also seeing smaller markets in different places across the country that are going under when they're the town or community's only grocery store. And what we've seen sometimes in even real red state, kind of conservative places has been the municipalities actually stepping in and saying, look, the private market with a traditional kind of investment model has failed to be able to provide us for basics like food. And so we're going to take it over. And so what you've seen in places from Kansas to Florida is local governments actually stepping in and taking over grocery stores. And I know that's not maybe necessarily of relevance to the businesses that y'all are trying to start, but the idea of receiving municipal investment and community investment for a lot of businesses that would not otherwise get that is starting to pop up in a lot of places. We've seen this across the Eastern Seaboard where nonprofit grocery stores have started to pop up. The Food Collective, when it submitted its tax-exempt status application to the IRS in 2010, there was a lot of confusion and concern that the IRS would not approve that. And what we've seen over the last decade is that the IRS is increasingly interested in giving tax-exempt status to different types of marketplaces that they would not have otherwise granted tax-exempt status to. So we're seeing a proliferation of nonprofit grocery stores, municipal-owned grocery stores, and just alternative-owned grocery stores. And so I think as we see movement happening at the state level to increasingly fund and support the development of worker-owned firms, where we're seeing nationally municipal ownership, we're seeing community ownership with some of these securities innovations. I think, as you were saying, Lars, like the sky is the limit. And if you have an idea of something that is looking to specifically attract investment and support from people who have not been able to take part in creating different firms or sustaining certain firms before, this is a really fruitful time for a lot of that.
Yeah. No, I agree with all of it. I think it will be a gradual change, and I think in some industries more than others. I think the food tech industry is probably a little bit newer, and it's not as burdened by the old structures maybe as some of the other high tech industries, and might be quicker in adapting some of these alternative collaborative structures, I would call it. Where you get both the innovation party in, the for-profit, the non-profit, and maybe the peer-to-peer lender as part of the system, and this feeding itself. That's my sense. And then I think I think there will be a change in how we compensate the employees and incentivize them. I think the stock options will become. They will always be with us, but I think many will we do a lot of late stage investing for a client, and that's when the companies are worth $1 billion or more, and when you look at the cap tables, a lot of the employees have been with them for 10 years, 10, 12 years, and I don't think that's when people join a startup, that's not what they have in mind, to be stuck there and then they can't leave because they will lose millions of dollars. They can't exercise that option, and so I think there some creative thinking or models around that will need to happen.
Wonderful. All right, we're going to open the floor for questions.
Please, in the back. And if you'd kindly say who you are.
Hi, I'm Albany. I have a question for Jay. So you mentioned that one of the sacrifices that people who work at co-ops might have to make is money. Are there ways that we can help ensure that people who work at co-ops can earn a living wage, especially in California when we know the cost of living is so high? How can we help these people get paid more so that we can open and run more co-ops?
Yes, it's a great question. I think ultimately one of the issues with worker cooperatives specifically is that there's a lot of questions around how you attract investment. And so when you look around and you're seeing the landscape of worker co-ops, which is, again, in California, really rich and super robust compared to a lot of other places, you start to see patterns. You see a lot of coffee shops, pizza places, and those pizza places and coffee shops are among the Bay Area's most successful places. I just did a site visit down at a Slice of New York in San Jose, which is a worker-owned pizza place that did their conversion about 6 years ago or so. So that's when they went from being a traditional kind of investment-oriented pizza plot to a worker-owned firm. And I talked to a bunch of the employees down there, and they're like, oh yeah, you gotta see this. And they like pull up their shirt, and the Slice of New York tattoo is on their bicep. And it's like, damn, like you all ride for this company. And so I think there's a degree to which we have to be clear, like these are mostly food companies that are providing a very different experience working at a food company than a lot of other places. So these are people that are making more than you would ever make in any other pizza shop, with better benefits and better retirement plans. But in the grand scheme of things, like even at the best pizza place in the Bay Area, it's still freaking hard to survive in the Bay. And so what that's pointing to is that there's a concern around how are you going to attract investment to start building out higher capital intensive firms like co-packers, like all of the different nodes that are important in a food tech ecosystem, when at the end of the day the capital that's being invested is not actually going to generate returns for the investor, and it's certainly not going to generate governance for the investor, because one of the principles of worker cooperatives is that the profit, the surplus, is reinvested with the employees, and the governance is not based off of how much money you invest, but it's actually based off of your labor and whether or not you're contributing to the business in that way. Which is all to say, I think there is a degree to which we can all say, like, yes, let's shop co-op, and like, let's do that. And when you look back at Berkeley specifically, historically, the old Berkeley Food Co-op, 100,000 consumer owners, $100 million annual revenue, 12 supermarkets across the Bay. It's possible to build out these really robust income generating systems using the cooperative model. And we should be looking at ways that we can attract additional investment into these companies to be able to build out the types of firms that require more capital to run, with machinery or different software or different types of, all the different things that capital intensive firms might need. One kind of trend that we're seeing is just a lot of investor education on this. So with EB Prec, they're buying properties in the Bay Area to convert into cooperatives that are millions and millions of dollars, and they're doing a lot of engagement with investors who are really interested in social change, but are basically just plowing the same amount of money into the firms that don't actually have robust accountability systems to ensure that the people that they're working with are actually getting not only benefit, but sustained ownership. And so investor education is a really big part of that. And then I think also, as we experiment with these different models, seeing how we can bring communities into elements of investment too, so that you're not investing, for instance, your pension plan, your pension plan or your 401k is not invested in fossil fuel companies, private prisons, all of the things that we know we don't actually want our retirement to be funded by. And instead, maybe you'd be interested in taking a small cut in your in your return on investment, but you know that it's going to be sustaining these desperately needed firms in your community run by your neighbors. So I think there's definitely let's all go shop co-op and use cooperatives as the contracts that we're making in our various positions. But more importantly than that, how do we expand the pool of people that are willing to take a chance on these businesses from the investment side?
Yeah, that's a great point. I just have an anecdote. So I have an 11-year-old daughter. She loves Chipotle. So she asked me to ask them when she could start working. She had to wait until she was 16. But anyhow, so then we drive the same day to, and I don't remember, they had a sign, $15.75 an hour. And then we drive to REI, which is a consumer cooperative, and they pay $3 more per hour. So, but I told them I'm not going to ask them when you can start working here. But I think the model should work to make sustainable wages. Or REI is one of my favorite stores too. So, and worth noting that the union drive there, which is at a consumer cooperative, both demonstrates the limitations to some of these models, where you can have a member-owned cooperative that's still treating its employees like dirt, but then also that they raise their wages in result of the union drive. By the way, the Berkeley REI union, or Berkeley IEI just unionized, so shout out to them. But that those types of worker agitation can still be really helpful, both in the kind of traditional marketplace, but also in the cooperative one too. Yep.
Another comment, question, please. Tell us who you are. And 5 seconds. Everybody stand up. 5 seconds. You stand up. You shake it around just a little bit here. People didn't drink enough of their good idea drinks, clearly. Okay, now you sit down. We are going to start speaking in just a couple minutes.
Should I stay standing?
Stay standing.
All right. Okay. Hi. So I'm Garrett Kitahara, and I'm actually one of the first Nordic Center Scholar recipients, and I went to Denmark this past summer and studied at Copenhagen Business School. So I have a question. It's been on my mind for the last few months especially. There's no large chain grocery store that's within the vicinity of campus, and there's tens of thousands of people that live here, and food and education go hand in hand, and I'm wondering if there's any properties that you're looking at or considering that are larger than just a small kind of closet space of the Berkeley Student Collective, because I think there's lots of building spaces around that could be converted into that type of grocery store, supermarket environment, and it would get lots and lots of sales, and I'm wondering if there's any initiative on that happening right now.
Yes, you should follow our Instagram. We have news on that front. We've been scoping out a lot of properties on campus, and the university, and specifically the ASUC Student Union, have not been super interested in a grocery store. And you can bring that up with them, but also you can follow the different work that we're doing on an ongoing campaign around that space in Lower Sproul. So certainly we have big plans for expansion, and we know that the campus's grocery needs are never going to be fulfilled by a 1,000 square feet space. It's just not possible. And so it's very much something we're spending a lot of time on and have already received a couple dozen thousands of dollars in grants to begin that planning process. But I agree. It's freaking hard to get groceries around here.
Persis, I'm coming to you.
Okay. I would be remiss as Robert's colleague if I didn't ask about Patagonia and Purpose Trust. And looking to the Nordics as an example of how that can be done, do you see a space for that type of model, as something that could work here? And I mean, we've seen it with Patagonia, obviously, the case could be made, but do you see that picking up steam or generating buzz locally or within the spaces you're currently in?
We have so when I started practicing 23 years ago, clients that came in, especially with the ambition of making the Silicon Valley journey, it was all about getting rich and quickly. But then I think 10 years ago or so, the young entrepreneurs coming in, they wanted to think ahead, and they wanted to set up a foundation off the bat. And so they would set up the for-profit, and then they would donate right away stock to the foundation. And for some of it worked, it took off in value. It was a very nice setup. For many, it didn't work. But I think people are thinking that way. I think this generated a lot of nice discussion, the Patagonia. But it's coming late in, because I don't remember now. I think he was a for-profit for the longest time, or he was a benefit corporation, I think.
Yes.
And then and then he donated this. But I think the younger generation, maybe more than the older generation, is thinking along those lines. You belong to the younger generation.
Well, I don't know too much about the Patagonia stuff, I'm afraid, but I have seen various critiques and some various affirmations. I think at the end of the day, the way that I approach the work of trying to build the world that I want to live in and pass along to the next generation is not by groveling at the feet of billionaires to give up their fortunes so that we might enjoy basic rights and dignity. The way that I'm trying to help others in building that world is from the ground up, and ultimately asking the billionaires to get that money will never be the solution to that. And I think every successful social movement in history has relied in some ways at some times on benefactors that have access to resources to fund some of the work that they're doing. And I think on the whole, we may be a little bit too reliant at this point in various social movements on getting the money, and we could be focusing a lot more on the organizing that's necessary. So I don't think, I'm not going to stand around and why are these billionaires giving away their money? No, but I do think that in terms of where we as people that are trying to create a better world and hopefully secure economic dignity for ourselves and for our families, that is not the place to look.
And we have a question back here. An individual, Pooja, that I had the great privilege to go to Copenhagen, Denmark as part of our course, Sustainable Capitalism in the Nordics, ? Pooja, please.
The question mark's very important. So this is one of my favorite topics, Robert knows. So Jay, you mentioned that there's certain trends in terms of the types of businesses that you see as worker-owned cooperatives, especially like in the food space, and you generally tend to see more ESOPs or employee stock ownership programs rather than worker cooperatives. Can you speak a little bit to do you think that there's, aside from the capital needs of certain industries, what is it about CPG or certain types of food companies that makes it really, really hard to, or makes it uncommon to see those models rather than just saying, hey, we'll have an employee stock program?
Yeah, I think if I'm understanding your question right, it's why are we seeing the specific portfolio of worker cooperatives and why are we seeing the particular portfolio of ESOPs? I think it involves, I think it just comes down to, the capital intensiveness of the various different things. I mean, to start a new food product, which at the Food Collective, we're always talking with new people that have these great ideas for new food products, new CPGs. It just takes a lot of money. It just takes a lot of money to do all the R&D for your stuff, to get all of the ingredients, to start scaling up, to start creating, it's just a very intensive process. Whereas, to start let's say a coffee shop, for instance, Alchemy Coffee in South Berkeley, a black worker-owned coffee shop, you get your espresso machines, it's going to be a little bit of money, and you get your people, and then boom, you open your doors and you're ready to go. Obviously, that's not to detract from the amount of money that it takes and energy that it takes to run a retail business like that. But at the end of the day, I really do think that if you just look at it down a line of what are the businesses that are being created as worker cooperatives specifically, you're just going to see that they're by and large low capital intensive businesses. And that's not to say that they're just retail food businesses. We see worker-owned consulting firms, worker-owned design firms. We have in our network a worker-owned architecture firm based out of Oakland. And so any business that you can start without that much money and that really relies on expertise and the workers' labor themselves is a promising kind of option. And I really do think that there's an education gap for a lot of folks that are interested in maybe starting their own communications firm or their own architecture firm or whatever. They just don't know that that's an option, or their lawyers have told them, like, I don't really have expertise in that, so it's kind of hard and it's difficult to find. So I think there is an education gap, but ultimately, I think, capital intensivity is a lot of it, and CPGs, while not the most capital intensive, you got to have a lot of money to be able to go along that process to regional or national success. Does that answer your question? Cool. Yeah, thanks for it.
And we are coming to time here. A couple of just very quick reflections, if I could, given this is the Nordic U.S. Food Summit. We're looking at the Nordics in part to learn about ourselves here in the United States. Many of us learn best through the comparative method, and I didn't know what the United States was until I stepped outside of it. I didn't know what an American corporation was until I stepped outside of it. And when we look at the Nordics, some really interesting historical movements, cooperatives, are so deep in the Nordic region. The largest retailer in Denmark is Coop. Over half the population is a member of Coop. And we see the things like Patagonia. It's revolutionary, this movement here to give $3 billion of value to a foundation. That's how most of the Danish stock exchange is set up. 2,000 companies where the founders did that. And that is not solving the problem, but it also helps to alleviate the concentration of power, because once that is given to a foundation, it's not given to their kids to perpetuate there. And I think that really brings us to a discussion of democracy that underlines so much of this. And what I hope that we can do part of here in the business school is discuss democracy. And how democratic are we here in the United States of America? What are the mechanisms to disperse power that are consistent with democratic ideals? And that also gets to Jay talking about labor unions. And a UC Berkeley professor wrote in the 1990s a book. He actually got pushed out of Berkeley. He was deemed too conservative and got pushed out of Berkeley. The book's title is The World's Strongest Trade Unions, the Nordic Labor Movement. 80+% of folks in labor unions, these are all power dispersing mechanisms consistent with democratic ideals. So those of us in the business school here, I think if we say we like capitalism, we need to couple that and say we like democratic capitalism. Dispersion of power so that capitalism actually works for the many of us and not just the few of us. And I think we have some good examples in the Nordic region. Directionally speaking, there is no perfection, there is no utopia, but directionally speaking, we can draw some real inspiration from the Nordics. Please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists. Thank you so very much.